let's discuss a little bit how when we start tracking the time for a particular activity, every second we will see that our scale is growing. So how this all happening? For this we have to open up component which stores that scale, that is progress item component, and right here we have declared one computed property called percentage. And by the way, this computed property gets recalculated every second if we are currently tracking time for some activity. But currently, as we can see, it is not clear which variables this computed property depends on, because for now inside of this property we're only referencing one reactive variable activity. But in fact, when we are tracking the time for some activity, this activity object is not updated. And what actually gets updated is an object from timeline items array. So how come then this computed property gets reevaluated whenever object from timeline items array is updated? Since we don't see any reference to reactive timeline items array in this computed property. And if we start digging deeper, for example, let's try to open up calculate direct activity seconds function, which is called inside that computed property. And this function calls another function, filter timeline items by activity. So let's take a look at this function. And finally, in the body of this function, we can see a reference to the reactive array timeline items. And that is why how that computed property is able to update every second as any object from timeline items array gets updated, because it is watching this reactive array. So now let's try to make all dependencies of this computed property percentage explicit. And in order to do so, all of them have to be referenced directly inside of this closure. So I'm going to pass reactive timeline items array as the first parameter inside calculate direct activity seconds function. Actually not the reactive array itself, but its underlined value by referencing property value. And now it becomes clear after looking at this function we can see all reactive variables that this computed property depends on. So now let's go ahead and modify a declaration of calculate direct activity seconds function by adding first parameter, which is timeline items. And now we have to pass forward this parameter timeline items to filter timeline items by activity function like so. And then let's find implementation of this function and add first parameter in here. And since this parameter is going to contain underlined value of timeline items reactive array, we no longer have to reference this array by using value property. So let's remove this reference and go back to progress item component. And here we have to obtain a reference to timeline items array. We can easily do so by basically importing this array from the global timeline items module right here. And actually due to this refactoring, we actually have to tweak another place in our application where calculate direct activity seconds function is used. So inside activity seconds to complete component, let's just pass timeline items array as the first parameter inside this function. And just like before, let's add an import statement for this array and import it from timeline items module. And one more time, let's go back to progress item component. There is also another call to calculate direct activity seconds function in this template. So timeline items array has to be passed as a first parameter in here as well. By the way, we can create another computed property which is going to hold value of direct activity seconds. So let's just cut this whole piece, use direct activity seconds computed property, then go up and declare the constant direct activity seconds, which will be of course computed property, and here we'll paste that code we just cut from our template. So we're basically going to return the result of executing calculate direct activity seconds function, and this value will become the value of this computed property. And another reason why we have done this refactoring is because we can actually reuse this computed property right here. So instead of calling this function again, let's reference direct activity seconds property. And to get the underlying value of this computed property, we need to reference property value. So let's move on and actually tweak another place inside timeline items module. And that is this function called filter timeline items by activity, because previously we have added another parameter to this function, and therefore we have to pass this parameter in here, and this should be timeline items array. First of all, we're going to accept timeline items array from outside into reset timeline item activities function, and then forward this array to filter timeline items by activity function like this. And after that, we of course have to find the place where reset timeline item activity function gets called. It is inside activity item component. So let's pass timeline items array as the first parameter into this function. Do not forget to actually import this array from our global store timeline items. So what we are actually able to achieve by doing all this refactoring in this lesson, and now looking at progress item component, specifically at these two computed properties percentage and tracked activity seconds, now their dependencies are explicit because we are referencing them directly in these two closures. And now it's actually clear to see that whenever one of those reactive variables will change, this will lead to updates of these two computed properties percentage and tracked activity seconds. So we no longer have to dig through function called stack to identify all reactive variables which these two computed properties depend on. So as always, at the end of the lesson, it is important to check if our application still functions properly. So I'm going to start tracking time for the coding activity and check if on the activities page this time will be decreasing, and on the progress page the scale will be increasing. So far everything is working as expected. Let's also select different activity and verify that now different scale is filled in. And finally, let's reset the timeout as stopwatch and make sure that all percentage values on the progress page will be zeros. So far so good, our refactoring was successful, and the link to the repository of this project will be in the video description.